Take your seats and up close to the front, if you will. Uh, the last time Mike was here last year, he just reminded me that it was back to school night. So, so many people who would have been here were at school. Who would have known tonight that this would happen with the trains? There's something about Mike, I guess, that. But anyway. Right. I want to thank you all for coming to our Authors on Stage program presented by the library in conjunction with Elm Street Books. And as you probably know, these programs are made possible through your donations. Not only these programs, but our movies and all the wonderful things that we have here. So I'm thanking you in advance for your generous donations. Mike, as I said, was with us last year in 2012 when he wrote his first book, T-Rex by the Tail, an anthem to a slice of history, an entertaining, witty look back into the days when every child knew who was the ruler in the family. And in Mike's family, it was his commanding father, the T-Rex. Tonight, Mike will return to the 70s with Bicentennial Rex, a prequel to this first book, where we again meet Carl Patton, who is holding on to the iron rule over his family and to convention. This is a generation when men were returning from Vietnam, young adults were distrustful of our nation's institutions, and closer to home, will the Patton children grow up as upstanding citizens, or will they turn over a part to peace, love, and protest movement? A little about Mike. He is from Southern California, and he has worked in the U.S. and Europe as a business insurance and healthcare consultant. And he's served as a regional CEO for an $8 billion division of a national insurer. And he's also been a national practice leader for healthcare and reform. But most of you probably know him with his hat on in those columns in the New Canaan News and Darien News, Lessons Learned. He has written a column for the past 7 years and has entertained us with stories of growing up with his 3 brothers. And I said, you have to tell us more about that tonight. As you described them, your conservative father and psychic mother. So please join me in welcoming Mike to the New Canaan Library. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a fun thing to do these. As all of you know, because I think many of you are friends who've been bribed to come on my behalf, and a few that I don't know, which is great. But it's a treat because this is a big passion of mine to write, and most of my friends are kind of the primary beneficiaries of all this. In fact, it started with youth football when I started to write a kind of fake column for parents that was called Under the Bleachers, not above in plain sight, but under, where I then kind of explained the seamier side of youth sports in as kind of lampooning and friendly way as I could, and in doing so it became pretty popular with the parents, and that kind of led to other things, and there was an enormous amount of encouragement around the writing. That led to writing for the newspaper, and growing up in a family with 3 brothers and a very kind of animated, hard-right father and a very kind of new age mother that were kind of diametric opposites, but always aligned on the things that mattered most, there was lots of rich material to draw from. And it was inevitable that I either seek out a therapist or I write. So it seemed cheaper to write, and so it's been a great experience to kind of lay it out, because inevitably everybody comes up and says, my father hit me like that too, or my father said those same words, or I grew up that way. And what I realized was there was a very unique generation that we're slowly kind of letting go of right now. And there's a great book that was written by 2 sociologists called The Fourth Turning. It was written by authors named Strauss and Howe, and their whole premise was that we go through basically 4 cycles every 100 years as a society, and we normally have what we consider to be a crisis that occurs, and the crisis might be a fiscal crisis in the form of depression, or it might be external in the form of a war, but invariably every society gets confronted with something that has the potential to bring it to its knees or destroy it. And out of the kind of maelstrom of that event, you find a generation that kind of steps up and becomes what the book defines as the hero generation. And that generation kind of takes on their shoulders the burden of what society has in front of it and tries to power through it. And during those periods of crisis, the institutions that are most valued are government, are the military, are things that are kind of collectively there to assist us in kind of getting through it. And if you think about the Depression, you think about World Wars I or II, or even the Civil War, or any of the periods of time that we've had, invariably those institutions were important. And society was all about us as opposed to me. It was all about making sacrifices. In fact, some of the individuals that were most celebrated during those times were ones that paid the ultimate sacrifice, either in war as heroes or in society by doing things that were extraordinarily selfless. And then that generation, the hero generation, tends to get us through that crisis. We come through, we're leaner, we're meaner, and then suddenly we give birth to the next generation, and they're known in this book as the builders. And the builders take these tools that have been given this crisis, typically a better society, and they build on it. And typically they build many things, and you go through a period of kind of prolonged affluence that follows the crisis that comes out of the builders building, and they give birth to a next generation. That generation is known as the prophets. And the prophets have an opinion about everything. Prophets look at all the institutions that are being built. They have an opinion about it. I like that one. It's not really about us. It's about him and her and them, and it's all of us, and each one of us individualistically should kind of be able to do our own thing. And they start to tear at the fabric of the very things that brought society together during that crisis. And they start to shred it and rip it apart and kind of deconstruct it. And as they deconstruct it, they change the tempo and the movement in society to where the things that we once celebrated are now things that we kind of scoff at and say, well, that's archaic, that's outdated. And then they finally give birth to the next generation, and that generation is known as the cynics. And the cynics basically kind of grow up in what they believe is kind of a society that really doesn't have much to follow, very few heroes, not a lot of kind of moral guardrails, and it's really all about me and what I need. The book basics premise is that we're in the period right now known as the fourth turning, and that we're very much in a period of time where society is kind of unraveling and we're building up to a crescendo to where we're going to go through a crisis. Whether that crisis is external in the form of a war, a nuclear weapon detonated by a terrorist, or just the fiscal meltdown of a nation that's kind of spending beyond its means. It's an interesting kind of premise. But the book does kind of take you through back to almost the year 1400, both in England and any westernized society, and shows you that those are cycles that just repeatedly work their way through. And it just shows you again and again and again. And when I wrote my first book, I think for those that read it, was as much a eulogy to my friend Steve Wood, who was a policeman here in town who died of pancreatic cancer. But as Dick and I know, we used to work out with Woody at the club all the time, and Wing knows him as well, and he was an extraordinary guy, and he was very conservative like my father. In fact, when he found out that I voted for Obama, he would not call me by my first name anymore. He just referred to me as the traitor. And he was in the Marine Corps. He was a decorated officer. He's one of the few officers here who've drawn his handgun and actually fired it, and there was a bank robbery down in Darien, and some bad guys were coming, racing through on their way through to New Canaan on 106, and he set up a roadblock and stopped him with a shotgun and was decorating. He said, "I got 2 days of vacation for it." But it was great, you know. He was just an extraordinary kind of guy, and even though at times we would fence politically, I loved him as a great friend. And when he got pancreatic cancer 2 years after he graduated or that he retired. I felt really sad, and I got very close with he and his wife, and I just said, people like this are kind of fading from our ranks, and very much like my father, who's still alive, but in many ways that generation, that whether you like their politics or not, they had enormous integrity just because they were so consistent in their point of view. And there was that rigidity also created a level of certainty for children who were growing up at that time, which is the certainty sometimes was fatal, but it was certain that if you did this, something was going to happen. There was no doubt about it. And I felt it was pretty funny because John, who's over there, grew up with 3 brothers, literally in my same hometown. and probably we're just minutes behind each other in whether it's lighting an illicit fire or doing something. But we grew up in a period in the 70s, which I kind of call the last age of Jurassic parenting, where the parenting was tough. There were take no prisoners. There was no child protective services to call in case your parent spoke poorly to you. There wasn't an award for everybody for participating. There were losers and there were winners, and you got summer jobs and you dealt with it, and there was always the threat of nuclear reprisal for anything that you did. And while people now look at the way that we are kind of raising our children, the jury's out as to whether the softer, negotiated style is going to yield progeny that's capable of taking on this fourth turning burden that we're heading into, or whether or not it's in fact, we could have torn a few more pages out of the old man's book. And so when I wrote my second book, I wanted to kind of plunge back into 1976, because I hear a lot today about everyone saying this is probably the worst of times. You've got a Democrat in the White House, you've got polarized Congress, you've got national debt at extraordinary proportions, and there's a lot of the dark mood among conservatives. That's why my brother and I thought it was very funny to create a poster promoting the book called "It's a Bitch Being a Republican." And because my father used to say in 1976, it's a bitch being a Republican. Because you had Jimmy Carter in the White House, you had 9.5% interest rates, you had the U.S. kind of image both domestically and abroad in tatters as a result of Vietnam. For those of us who are alive, every one of us had friends who had brothers or someone that fought in Vietnam. When they came home, they were partially broken people. And so I thought it would be an interesting experiment to kind of dive back into the year 1976 and kind of walk through an entire year in the shoes of a straw man family, coincidentally very similar to my own, with many of the same characters. But in order to be invited home for Thanksgiving, I had to make them amalgams and composites, and I had to make the book fiction. And I also then had to give the copy of it to my father to read before I would dare publish it. And even then, after I did it, my wife said, "You're crazy, you don't do that." But I felt the need to go ahead and do it, and Bicentennial Rex was born. So each of my brothers, there are four of us, and as you know, if you come from a multi-child family, there is a real kind of sinister predictability about sequencing of children. There's the first child who's either, who tries to kind of be obedient, but they tend to get the full radiation of the parents because they're the first kid. The parents don't have a handbook. They're making it up as they go along. And if you just happen to grow up in the house of an ex-military man like my brother Miles did, it's amazing that he survived to his 16th birthday. The second one just basically wants to get out of there as fast as they can and does the opposite of everybody else. In my case, my brother really thought that he was a Rockefeller and there'd been a mistake at the hospital. And that the real family, who was worth a lot of money and lived in a nicer house, would come get him. It never happened, which was a problem for him. But I was the third, and clearly just glad to be in the lineup, and usually just short enough that I could be off doing something that was not necessarily appropriate. But I had a bad habit of getting caught. And then the fourth was a really poor attempt at a girl. And Patricia became Patrick, and my mom said, "That's it, I'm done, 4 boys, that's it, that's all I can handle." And he probably was the smartest among us. And so after that sequence of kids, I took everyone's neuroses and little peccadillos and molded them all up and played Mr. Potato Head with different kinds of ears and noses, and I put them together and created the characters that are in this book. The book is written in 4 seasons. So it starts in December and ends in November of 1976. So what I thought I'd do is I'd read some excerpts from each season, and then if we have time afterwards, and the last time I read something that I had just written that hadn't been published, then I can do the same if there's time, and if not, it'll eventually end up in the paper, I'm sure. So, any questions before I begin? All right, great. So I am first going to read about the mother of the family. And in this particular house, the father obviously is fashioned out of the most conservative timber, but the mother was raised in Northern California, and just by that alone, she might as well be a communist, according to the father, who believes anyone from essentially north of Santa Barbara has kind of underground contact regularly with the Russians and the Chinese. So, but she was also an extraordinary woman, and raising 4 boys, she understands basically the notion that she kind of subscribes to the notion there are no bad kids, only bad choices. And so, at a time of parenting where we really kind of pillory our kids and we put their names in the newspaper and we drag them through the mud and do all this thing, there was a different kind of community standard that was enforced. Susie did not take kindly to poisonous suburban gossip or the snarky housewives who undermine newcomers and unconventional families like white blood cells attacking a foreign pathogen. Susie had grown up on the other side of disapproving stares from neighbors and pious church-going families in Northern California. Her wild uncles and brothers were routinely in trouble with authority figures. It was not uncommon to see an O'Reilly male arrested or in hot water for provoking the privileged that ran the community. Susie had learned from her mother to protect her own. She perambulated through the lives of her husband and boys like an Irish beat cop, scanning the alleys and shadows for anything that might lead them astray or unfairly impugn their character. Privacy and reputation were family heirlooms to be treasured and preserved. She had no tolerance for people who might attempt to discuss personal business. When she moved to Huntington Hills, she made a habit of turning her boys about thinking for themselves and rising above other people's preoccupations with scandal and speculation. Susie was a huge fan of Eleanor Roosevelt and often quoted her when coaching her sons on the finer points of small towns and gossip. Boys, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss other people. She was also fond of telling her children that no one could make them feel inferior without their consent, another Roosevelt maxim. She practiced what she preached and was a trusted confidant to a growing legion of women who were discovering that they had choices and power. Liberated housewives no longer needed to live lives of quiet desperation or derive their self-esteem from their husband's accomplishments. Susie had a wide range of friends that included a new breed of independent women, divorcees, widows, opinionated mothers, and working moms. She was a reliable nexus for information and freely shared what she had learned about men as she managed her own den of thoughtless troglodytes. Because Susie listened attentively to all her friends and could disarm anyone into sharing their most intimate secrets, Carl had nicknamed her Sodium Pentothal. Like the Red Cross, she was a first responder, always ready to lend a hand to families in crisis, gravitating towards real people and avoiding those who spent their energies trying to safeguard a veneer of perfection. Susie hated the fact that children often were forced to bear the scarlet letter of dysfunction for the sins of their parents. To her, a broken home was not a transgression or a sign of social leprosy, but a human tragedy. Because kids were clearly more at risk in single-parent households, Susie took it upon herself to open her home to the friends of her boys who might otherwise be stigmatized simply because they were the products of a divorced or alcoholic home. She was not naive and certainly regulated access to a subset of children she referred to as lampwicks. These were life's trouble seekers and lower companions. But she gave every kid a chance and saw it as her responsibility to afford some structure to children who had done nothing wrong other than drawing the short straw in the cabbage patch. Susie admired divorced women who had the guts to kick out a philandering husband or remove themselves from a bad marriage. She noted that a small town often turned its back on single moms and that some women considered recent divorcees as a threat to their own marriages or perhaps a sign of character weakness. You know, she couldn't keep her man from straying. If she knew anything, she knew that men, and she regarded most of them, she knew men, and she regarded most of them as egomaniacs with inferiority complexes. As middle age brought crow's feet to their eyes and pounds to their waist, insipid men sometimes sought solace and fleeting self-esteem in the arms of secretaries and cocktail waitresses. The really dim-witted ones cheated right in their hometown. She sensed that Kitty was having marital problems. Kitty is a good friend of hers in the book. She could smell it the first time she'd met her husband, Garrett Erickson. His eyes had lingered on Susie for a millisecond too long, and his half-smile suggested that they had met before. In her past life working as a maid in her parents' boarding house, she had crossed paths with many guys like Garrett. They were charming scavengers and relentless souls, asymptomatically ill with the malignancy of self-centered need. Rumor had it that Garrett was carrying on with another woman who lived in town. Susie was waiting for the moment when Kitty might take her into her confidence. So that is winter. What do you think, George? All right. So we now go to the early part of the new school year. And for those of us that remember, we had something called driver's education. Now, contrary to, I think our kids may still get this, but when I grew up, you had to sign a release paper, and then you went in and saw the goriest movies you'd ever seen, ever. Headless people, accidents. It was actually, there was a guy by the name of Richard Waymer who was an Ohio accountant, and he was a bit of a ghoul. And in real life, Richard Waymer would have his CB radio, and he would listen for police reports, and he would get his 8mm camera, and he would go out and be a first responder to these accidents and take videos and then sell them to the Department of Highway and Safety, which they would then turn into films. And they made a video about Richard Waymer called Hell's Highway, the story of Richard Waymer. But Richard Waymer was, in fact, the architect of many of the films that we were subjected to, and this is a little bit about some of the boys and their first experience. The name of it's chapter 8, and there's usually a quote at the beginning of every chapter, and the quote in this chapter is, "The best substitute for experience is being 16." In a rite of passage reminiscent of Malcolm McDowell's Shock Therapy and A Clockwork Orange, high school freshmen of the 70s were subjected to highly graphic movies of car crashes, mangled bodies, and twisted metal. The movies attempted to dissuade drivers in DIWs, drivers in waiting, from becoming DWIs, driving while intoxicated. Authorities felt the need to underscore that the automobile was hardly a toy. It was, in fact, according to Carl Patton, a goddamn 1-ton projectile of destruction. The new year meant a license for George, a privilege that first required driver's education classes and weekend rides with the instructor and JV basketball coach, Coach Party Marty Mooney. But before a boy could even clip into a safety belt, he must endure the much-anticipated driver's education film, Red Asphalt, a gruesome cinematic montage of vehicular death. John and Matthew had told George, John and Matthew are the two older boys, so they told their younger brother, John and Matthew had told George about the highway safety films. As a 15-year-old, George had not seen many R-rated movies. Ultraviolence was an emerging form of art in the minds of directors like Sam Peckinpah and Stanley Kubrick. Graphic films were a forbidden fruit reserved for mature audiences only. To George and his buddies, the idea of seeing something in school that might fetch an M or even an X rating was almost too good to be true. The lights dimmed. The air was thick with adolescent anticipation. George sat silently while Glenn Bull and Teddy nervously joked with paper tiger bravado. Girls squirmed and shifted in their seats as if they were about to dissect a frog in biology. This was serious stuff. Susie had to sign a permission slip for George to attend class that day. The film was faithfully threaded through the projector by the AV geek, and with a flip of the switch, the film credits for Red Asphalt fell ominously down the screen like the broken lines of a 2-lane killer country road. Within 5 minutes, the class was on its heels, having been among the first responders to 3 horrific car wrecks, including one in which a guy had been decapitated. Someone whispered in the dark, "My brother told me last prom has a guy with has a pipe all the way through his head." Suddenly, Inez Del Riggio jumped out of her seat and moaned as she tried to make it to the door. Stumbling through the flickering projector light, she vomited across the shoes of Charlie Hildebrand. Someone screamed while another voice yelled, "Hey, Coach, we got a puker." It all happened so quickly, just like the young man in the coupe who tried to outrun the Southwestern Pacific train and ended up looking like a home economics burnt chicken. The Department of Highway Safety tried to show George and his friends the consequences of bad choices that could be for a young driver driving a VW Carmen Ghia. However, most of the graduating class of 1979 was too mesmerized by the sight of blood, brains, and guts to really register that those entrails could be their own if they chose to blindly pass an 18-wheeler on a 2-lane highway in New Mexico. George decided that when he did learn to drive, he would avoid the southwestern United States altogether. Next to facial hair or the discovery of your father's stash of girly magazines, a driver's license was a defining moment. Official recognition of a boy's ascent out of the oppressive canyon of adolescence into the great plateau of manhood and autonomy. Freedom from parental oppression was abetted by a motor vehicle. A car was a plane ticket to exotic places far from the supervision of adults whose principal job was to ruin your life. By age 16, George was under the impression that the only difference between an East German bloc country and his own household was the lack of bread lines. His father had become increasingly intolerable as he stressed out at work by day and came home at night looking for a fight. Carl clashed with George on grades, bedtime, curfew, where he was going for the evening. Matthew had returned home, the oldest son, Matthew, had returned to Berkeley. John was adroit at avoiding trouble, which left Carl and George to brawl like street fighters. Susie did her best to diffuse the tensions between father and son, but there was no way to avoid the time that they must spend together learning how to drive the family cars. Subscribing to the Irma Bombeck School of Driver's Education, Susie refused to accompany any kid when it was time to master the art of driving the Impala and the Pinto. Susie's extrasensory perception told her that teaching any of her 4 sons to drive would be her undoing. The responsibility for motor vehicle instruction fell to Carl, who dreaded the act of slipping into the passenger side of the car. Carl was not wired to be a passenger. He was master and commander and had been driving the family station wagon as well as exclusively piloting his own work car, the sleek Sienna Brown Ford Granada. For years, the act of turning over car keys to a 16-year-old male offended him. Susie told Carl that the boys had to practice driving on every car, including his precious Granada. The moment George entered Carl's car, the owner's tics and anxious behavior began. Disconcerted and disoriented by the lack of control, he winced and placed both hands on the dashboard as George adjusted his rearview mirror, moved the driver's seat, and adjusted its angle. It was as if George was putting on Carl's clothes while he was still in them. Carl immediately shouted out instructions. Turn the indicator, watch the curb. Jesus, look out for that car. Watch it, okay, go, go, go. All this would unfold within a 10-yard span of the driveway, leading from the family 2-car garage to an empty suburban street. The journey was hell for both father and son. George needed to follow instructions to earn the privilege of continued learning, and the father grudgingly allowing his progeny to operate his favorite toy. Carl's Granada was a coddled baby that was not washed, but bathed by whichever son owed Carl the most money, with a chamois cloth, I kid you not, with a chamois cloth the size of a cocktail napkin, and waxed faithfully for a long week's journey that lay ahead. Susie was allowed to operate his car only in the event of geopolitical emergencies, such as an imminent nuclear attack. Children were not allowed to touch anything, to change a radio station, adjust the air conditioning, or even pass wind in his car was a Class 1 felony. On the other side of the driveway was the lime green Pinto and the Impala station wagon. These family cars had endured every indignity that could be visited on them by 2 teenage drivers and countless thankless male passengers. The vehicle's interiors resembled refugee camps, while the Granada remained as pure as the day it rolled off the assembly line in Flint, Michigan. When Carl brought home his new car, Susie said, if you need some garbage to put in your car until you accumulate a few items of your own, there's plenty in the Pinto. Carl's driving lessons with George always ended before their scheduled time. Pull over, you're going to get us killed. What? George said. I missed that dog by 3 feet. George and Carl would return home and the door would slam twice as son and then father retreated to their individual caves of self-pity. Susie looked at the noise, hummed as she polished the silver. Susie looked up at the noise as she polished silver in the kitchen, content to be next of kin in the event that her men did not return. So this is now going to take you to summer, and this may give you a little bit of insight into the character of Carl, but I think you're already kind of getting a little bit of an indication. Now, in this book, too, we also have a Vietnam veteran. I didn't go into great detail, but I did kind of do a lot of research with friends who are in the military about what happened to many of the guys in Vietnam and then after they came home. And for a lot of them, it was kind of a broken time for them. And I don't think America probably did the best effort in terms of helping them assimilate back into society. And while the characters like Carl felt these guys were heroes, they weren't really sure what to do with them. And then when they broke ranks and began to kind of act out as a result of all the things they brought home with them, society really didn't know what to do with them. But in many ways, and if you lived through that, then you understood after the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War how America reacted so differently, how standing in an airport, everyone would stand up and applaud soldiers as they came through. And in many ways, it wasn't just a reaction to the war itself, but it was also a loose apology for things that we overlooked years ago. Carl hated summer. He felt a 3-month vacation for children was an anachronism. It was the last manifestation of an age of buggy whips and agrarian living, when laborers of all ages were needed to plant, tend, and harvest the community's food. The notion of hard labor in the fields had been lost in the industrial age, along with a work ethic that had suffered a sickening setback with the birth of the baby boomers. Kids had the audacity to view chores as an imposition of hard labor rather than a privilege to contribute to family and society. Summer was a time when industrious young men and women should be harnessed like plow horses and sent to labor anywhere, earning the redeeming calluses gained only through the use of a shovel, plow, or milking stool. Carl considered the extended summer break collectivist pollution drift from Europe. Like much of the Gaelic culture, it was outmoded invention of a lethargic liberal government. Time off from hard labor could easily turn any man into a cheese-eating milk toast with a doctorate in surrender. Susie agreed that 90 days with no structure could exacerbate the already terminal condition known as adolescence. Idle hands were the devil's workshop, and boys needed to be busy. On Memorial Day, Carl gathered John, George, and Freddie in his offices. Boys, your mom and I are underwriting your college education, and we can't keep paying your allowances. From now on, weekly chores will be done because you live here. If you want to earn money, you will need to get a job. As far as I'm concerned, allowance is a relic of the past. It's like welfare. People begin to view it as an entitlement, and Carl, Susie interrupted, the boys don't need a political science lesson. Well, anyway, we're not a damn money tree that you're going to shake for the rest of your life. The primary source of any income for a kid was yard work. Somehow cleaning someone else's yard for money seemed less onerous than cutting your own lawn. The main tool of the trade was an ancient lawnmower, a rusted manual cutting cylinder with a rotating blade. The simple mechanical design was unimproved since it was invented sometimes before Christ, most likely by a Greek teen who could no longer stomach cutting the family wheat with a scythe. But he was told he could not attend the Poison Oracles concert at the local amphitheater until the field was clean. A lawnmower is harder to push than a shopping cart with a broken wheel. To operate the cast iron monstrosity, a 125-pound kid would have to back up several paces to build enough momentum to cut through any lawn higher than a half an inch. As the blade ripped through the various varieties of suburban grass, Bermuda, St. Augustine, fescue, and Kentucky blue, the whirling blades filled the air with green shrapnel and debris. By the end of a lawn cutting session, a kid resembled a bizarre grasslands creature covered in flecks of emerald sweat and insects du jour. It seemed the grass fell everywhere except in the ancient grass canvas catcher that precariously sit on the back of the machine on 2 hooks adjusted to the wheel. After raking up grass, boys were expected to edge the lawn with a device that looked like the unholy union of a jousting stick and a pizza cutter. The metal blade knifed along the sidewalk and garden beds as one carefully trimmed the rectangle of property to geometric perfection. An uneven or overgrown yard was tantamount to hygiene. It suggested to neighbors that things were not well at your house. A homeowner could not control his lawn, was most likely unable to hold the rest of his life together. Leaves were cleaned up and accumulated with a medieval device known as a rake. It was a cumbersome implement made from fragile metal strips that made a distinct scratching sound as they were dragged across garden beds and backyards. If raking was not tedious enough, it was followed by the final indignity involving the deposit of the debris into the trash. A boy might try to launch leaves into a neighbor's bushes or ivy, but in tight suburban quarters of Los Angeles, gardeners were expected to place leaves in trash cans, then stomp down on them to make more room for clippings. Invariably, the trash can would tip, vaulting its rider and the day's works of clipping onto the cement, where the budding landscaper would lie for moments, bleeding and angry. Eventually, however, one became expert in jamming 80 cubic feet of leaves into a 20-pound trash can. It made Carl quiver with pride to see his sons bouncing up and down on the cans, tamping down debris like serfs in the fields. There would be times out of sheer elation that he would come out and jump in the trash cans with him. So I'm going to read one little small piece because it is the Bicentennial Rex, and it just kind of is something that in our town, not unlike New Canaan, we had an annual 4th of July parade. We had a place that we gathered, and it was kind of the nexus for everything. And in this particular book, while the town is gathering, some not so good things are going on from one of the boys on the other side of town. But It is. It was very much a part of the tradition and fabric of where I grew up, where that's where that's where it all came together once a year, and you saw the best sides of your community. This is a quote from Irma Bombeck. You have to love a nation that celebrates its independence every July 4th, not with a parade of guns, tanks, and soldiers who file by the White House in a show of strength and muscle, but with family picnics where kids throw frisbees, the potato salad gets iffy, and the flies die from happiness. You may think you have overeaten, but it's patriotism. The 4th of July reveals much about a small town. In its preparation, one can measure the populace's capacity to work together and subordinate their differences. In celebrating any birthday, people reveal their commitment, apathy, excess, and parsimony. The nucleus of any community is its volunteers, those who show up to staff the concession stands, decorate the floats, drive the ancient fire truck, dust off the old trombone to play Dixieland jazz, and lose themselves entertaining children and the elderly. The bicentennial festivities of Huntington Hills were intended to remind everyone that freedom is earned and its privileges are worth defending. In a town of 16,000 souls, freedom meant the opportunity to move in any direction, chart your own trajectory, conform to society, or rub against its grain. Carl felt the flutter of happy anticipation for the first time in several months. He was looking forward to the parade and the picnic. He had spilled a little blood protecting the integrity of the parade, but was proud of his civilian Purple Heart. I don't want to give away this part of the book. Let's see. Carl had missed Korea and had heard stories of the heroism and sacrifices at places like Pork Chop Hill, The Hook, and the Frozen Chosen. He wondered, like all men, what he would do if faced with a life and death situation. His favorite book had always been Les Miserables. He understood and sympathized with Jean Valjean. In the suburban splendor of America, a man did not get up every day wondering if someone was going to knock on his door and take him away because of his religious or political affiliation. He was not forced to choose between crime or starvation. He had never had to test his own values to know whether he was a sunshine patriot or a man for all seasons. It was 11:30, and he was due at City Hall with Susie to prepare for the parade. The procession would start at 3 o'clock and conclude at the park at 4. Most of the town would be spread across a patchwork quilt of blankets and lawn chairs at the destinations of Rose's Park. From 10,000 feet, the community park now looked like a pair of discarded plaid pants. The green belt of property that had been donated to the town in the 1920s by a wealthy industrialist had served as a gathering place for families for more than half a century. Many residents identified with the 30-acre sanctuary as a monument to personal firsts. The wobbly 15 feet of a bike without training wheels, an awkward stolen kiss, a disgusting sip of forbidden beer, or the first chance to watch a sky illuminated with 1,000 floral bursts of 4th of July fireworks. Rose's Park smelled of summer grass and endless possibility. Like the town itself, it was virtually impossible not to encounter a friend or acquaintance while walking your dog or jogging. It was a sacred setting made special because of the people and their understanding that once a year, they would celebrate being part of something bigger than themselves. Okay, and I'll conclude with this last piece, and those are for those that had as dysfunctional a Thanksgiving as we would have at our house. You add relatives and alcohol, and then you duck. Freddie donned his normally dreaded church clothes for Thanksgiving. Now, Freddie is the youngest. He was flush with self-esteem. Somehow the shirt collar did not feel so tight, and the gray wool slacks didn't itch so much. The hand-me-down loafers did not bite his heels. On this night, his turkey would retain the rich taste of the hunt. The mashed potatoes would melt on his tongue like butter on a hot skillet. The pumpkin pie would finally appeal to his more mature palate, tasting like fresh pastry snatched from the windowsill of an Amish farmhouse. That, of course, if Freddie could penetrate the swarm of adult locusts who always preceded him at every holiday meal. It was 3 o'clock. The dining room had been transformed into a New England harvest celebration with a holiday centerpiece with husks of amber and yellow corn, gourds, miniature pumpkins, and freshly autumn-colored flowers. The sideboard was crowded with steaming dishes of yams, mashed potatoes, green beans, Brussels sprouts, 2 kinds of stuffing, cornbread, and a bizarre paste called bread sauce that was an old country favorite of Thomas Riley's. Carl and his father-in-law were first through the Thanksgiving food line. Chivalry died each Thanksgiving, at 3:01, when the lords of the manor exercised their prerogative to initiate the cavalcade of consumption. The men moved slowly like bull elephants, surveying every dish like discriminating judges at a Mideastern bake-off. To Susie's horror, they heaped massive portions on their plate, amassing a Mount Everest of food. Thomas was feeling no pain after several screwdrivers. He ate as he walked through the line, stuffing a roll in his mouth as he turned to ask Matthew questions. Spraying breadcrumbs on every patent child, he uttered something completely incomprehensible. Max, the dog, was swimming underneath Thomas O'Reilly like a pilot fish, darting in and out of his legs and licking up all the bread. Susie scolded her father, "Dad, don't talk with your mouth full." She was also quietly doing the math on the food portions and realized that it was now unlikely that anyone under 6 feet tall would be eating anything other than dark meat, yams, and a couple of string beans. Off in the distance, CBS sports announcers Pat Summerall and Tom Brookshire were overheard discussing the pathetic Detroit Lions, who were 5-6 heading into this year's game. Carl hated any team from the NFC Central that competed with his Bears. He was rooting for the Bills since they had drafted USC graduate O.J. Simpson. Despite the chaos of the holiday, Susie understood that Thanksgiving was the one day likely to be celebrated by everyone, irrespective of religious affiliation. A baking turkey blended with the aroma of sautéed onions, sausage, stuffing, and celery created the most reassuring of all moods. It was a time for family, no distractions, gifts, holiday cards, competing social obligations, religious services, or pressured traditions. It was about eating and talking with your mouth full. Thanksgiving also heralded the beginning of the season of family dysfunction, where age-old scars would tear open and disagreements could flare. It invariably started with the Thanksgiving prayer. Once a year, the entire Patton family would hold hands across generations, and Carl would christen the family feast. Lord, thank you for blessing us this year and for providing us this generous bounty. Please bless all those in our family who can't be with us here today. Watch over those who are less fortunate, and please help those in Washington to not be corrupted by the self-interest of their own need for re-election, but instead to act with integrity and decisiveness to protect the interests of our free market, our democracy, and our society, where there are no social, educational, or financial barriers to success if one is willing to work hard enough. Lord, please safeguard the greatest nation in the world and allow us to firmly stand up as a formidable alternative to the corrupt long shadows of communism. Oldest boy Matthew sighed, and Susie looked at her oldest son with furrowed brows. Carl leered at Matthew. And please help to improve the education and perspective of those too blind to see the obvious shortcomings of charlatans disguised as giveaway artists. Susie spoke up. Carl, my beautiful feast is getting cold, and I am certain that God gets your point. Of course he does. He's a Republican, Carl said defiantly. Susie looked up and saw her father had fallen asleep with his open mouth, and she nudged her mother, who in turn sharply elbowed Thomas O'Reilly in the ribs. What? Oh, amen. Dinner was a collision of diagonal conversations, laughter, gilded nostalgia, and good-natured insults. Yet there was lots of issues to be anxious about in November of 1976. Liberal and, excuse my French, liberal and shit for brains were common pejorative pronouns ascribed to anyone who opposed Carl's reasonable and well-informed views on domestic and foreign policy. As Susie and Katie cleared the plates, Carl lamented the recent plans for a high-occupancy traffic lane, known as the Diamond Lane, through Los Angeles. The damn thing was created by some liberal do-gooder who wanted to reward people to have more children. It's another incentive to get money to people who are on welfare. Matthew could stand the vitriol of his father no longer. Dad, how can you possibly impute the creation of a multi-passenger lane to reduce carbon emissions so we might breathe our air and occasionally see our mountains to a liberal conspiracy to promote more welfare mothers? In the soft gray of his intoxication, Thomas O'Reilly was proud of his grandson for standing up to his father, but also pondering Carl's theory on rewarding promiscuity. Thomas was a big proponent of personal responsibility and felt people were too reckless sexually today. Kids these days favored sexual promiscuity as long as it was with someone you loved or someone willing to split the hotel bill. The boy's got a point, Carl. You Southern Californians steal our water and have no rapid transit. You drive your damn cars everywhere. You are less than half the state's population, and you consume 3/4 of its resources. Since when did this become an 1166 local meeting? Carl said. By the way, The last person that ever made income redistribution work was Jesus Christ, when he turned the loaves and fishes into food to feed the masses. He was probably a liberal. Face it, Jesus was mortal, and it was his father, God the Republican, who helped make the miracle happen. And note how I said miracle. Trying to feed more mouths than you have food for is not humanly possible. You need a goddamn miracle. Yet every day in Washington, we see those idiots try and do just that. Give away what you don't have. In the real world, we do that. We go into debt, and then we all starve. Matthew stared at his father with his mouth open. Carl realized, smirking, that he had his son's full attention. Everyone knows God is a Republican. The whole damn Old Testament is a rule book on how to kick ass, take names, and manage those who are too stupid to think for themselves. You mess up, boom, a plague on your house. You worship the wrong God, splat, your phi poop on an Egyptian chariot windshield. Are you serious? How did we get from the diamond lane to God being a Republican? Freddie sat into the table listening to the debate. He never really thought about God being a member of the grand old party. His mother had secretly told him once that God was really a woman. As for diamond lane, he assumed Catholics and Mormons would be driving the majority of cars in the special lane reserved for fertile families. He was not sure what welfare was, but he began to suspect that having more than 4 kids was a great financial burden. Why else would you need financial assistance? Carl advanced his attack on the left. When Reagan was governor, we had a balanced budget and the business was booming. The GOP chose Ford over Reagan. No wonder we lost. Reagan is the guy that you want to give the ball to on the last play of the game because somehow he will find a way to score. Dad, Matthew said, you're reading too much John Birch pamphlets. Reagan ratted out his friends during blacklisting, while at the same time he was representing them as the head of the Screen Actors Guild. He was a Democrat, but then he got a little money and switched to the GOP because he wanted to keep it. He speaks for General Electric and learned all his capital tricks from them. Thomas Raleigh chuckled. Carl, looks like your tuition's going to good use. The boy knows his history and is learning to speak his mind. Capitalist tricks, Carl said? Jesus Christ. Those capitalist tricks are paying for his commie education. When he graduates with a degree in poly BS, what's he going to do? Build huts in Africa with all the crap that comes out of his mouth? He could start his own political party. The mental, I won't say the word, but it starts with an M. I suspect he will want to marry someone from another country, have little commies, and send them to the University of Moscow. As the political gloves came off, the tenor and tone grew sharper. Susie pretended not to hear, while Katie, being from a generation that had long since abandoned personal views that differed from her husband, hummed as she did the dishes. It was now 6 p.m. and Thomas was pickled and ready to pour another glass of wine. Thanksgiving at the Pattons was a more realistic depiction of Norman Rockwell's iconic freedom from want. Yet the debate seemed to center not on having too little, it was about having too much. As the voices rose and the barometric pressure dropped, the women melted away, ostensibly to clean up, but really just to escape the oncoming storm of opinions. It was a domestic version of Dine and Dash. George and John loitered near the table, torn by boredom, but hoping to overhear one of Carl's infamous blue streaks of profanity. No amount of pumpkin, pecan, or apple pie could sweeten his dislike for liberals. His passion and deep conviction could not be restrained. Thanksgiving was a time to be grateful, and gratitude included appreciating those people who kept our economy chugging, our country safe from foreign interests, and our minds out of the gutter. While Carl's ethos was born out of wholesome Midwestern values, it was protected by barbed wire views, political landmines, and shoot first and ask questions later guard towers. His views were not shared so much as they were released like water from a high-pressure hose. They were intelligent, rational, and totally devoid of compassion. No one ever gave me a damn thing, he sputtered. Finally, Susie could take it no more. Honey, don't talk with your mouth full. Later in the evening, the bodies were discarded around the house like accident victims. The Thanksgiving topics had shifted to more benign subjects like sports and the upcoming holidays. Thomas O'Reilly was passed out on the couch, and Freddie had fallen asleep under the dining room table dreaming about his game-winning catch that day in the Turkey Bowl. Susie loved this day. It was a time when everyone was reminded that life's epicenter was family. It was a chance to fill rooms with voices of generations, laughing, debating, wrestling, struggling, rising and falling. The spirit of Thanksgiving was still all about us. Their extended family was a unit, a team that looked out for one another, tolerated each other's eccentric foibles and diverse political views, but remained deeply bonded by the fact that no one on earth knew them better than they knew each other. On this day, there was much to be thankful for. Freddie woke up and glanced at the thin ankles and bare feet of his mother and grandmother as they rearranged the dining room. He was content. Freddie Patton, a single-cell amoeba, had entered the pantheon of Turkey Bowl heroes. perhaps on his way to evolving into something bigger and more accomplished. He frowned, realizing that he must wait till next Thanksgiving for his chance to show that this year was not a fluke. Only 364 days to go. So I'm happy to open it up. I know we've gone past our time, or I guess we're kind of right on time. Happy to answer any questions, or if you want a little bit more reading, I've written something that's going to appear soon enough in the paper. If you need to get wine and just do your thing, that's fine too. So I'll leave it up to our hosts, the library, and whatever you'd like.
Well, it's kind of amazing how you picked up every family in that recipe. We all suffered through all that.
Oh yeah, I think so. And what I find interesting is that, we either by, I think my father always says Dr. Spock ruined everything. Because I certainly, there was a whole new kind of generation of parenting, that was that. What I find so interesting about 1976 is Gloria Steinem, and I talk about that a lot in the book, really came out and started telling women, look, you got a choice. You don't have to, walk 3 feet behind your husband and basically just live a life of quiet desperation. You're not happy, just do something else. Well, that was very threatening. I think between Gloria Steinem and Cesar Chavez organizing labor, my father was completely, and then you add in, kind of the Watts riots down in downtown LA, you add in all this stuff going on domestically as the fabric of the US had kind of torn up in the late 60s, but it was still playing out post-Vietnam. And in 76, Laos and Cambodia had just fallen, Vietnam's done, the Republicans are over, Jimmy Carter's getting elected, the economy's going south with really high interest rates. And against that backdrop, you're trying to kind of hold your family together. And that generation was raised by the heroes. The heroes kind of were the parents they shouldered the burden during the Depression. And my father's generation was a silent generation. And they were kids during the Depression. So you ask him, how was the Depression? He said, we were all poor. It was all the same. There was no, distinctions were generally pretty de minimis. There was a massive compression, basically.
What I found interesting is that I come from a generation 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
No, I think it is. I think because in many ways, I think, most families that kind of, every family out of 7 billion people in the world want the same thing. They want to raise their children properly. They want to kind of deal with their environment. They want to kind of manage the external forces. They're constantly pulling at the elbows of their kids that might steer them in the wrong path. They want to, economically, they don't necessarily want to, live in poverty. They want to be able to do their own thing. And I think that most parents that out there really ran some rigid guardrails. They really were tough. And not only that, but I think they did a better job than we did in enforcing the consequences of things that happened, where I think we fatigue under it a little bit as a generation. But I would say a lot of us had the same role models, whether they were 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier. There was just a certain kind of, and my father wasn't interested in being my friend. My job is to prepare you and shove you out, and you're off the payroll at 18. And, we'll talk about college, and, my dad paid for our college, but he actually charged us 40% out of every dollar I made doing chores, he took 40 cents out of it and put it in something called the college fund. So I was in a higher marginal tax rate then than I was now, actually. But it was, there were all these little things, and we had to work. Every morning we got up, and there was a work list laying out all the things, and these are things you do because you live here, and these are things that basically are eligible for wages. And before NAFTA, I think there was we were paying, there was no way that anybody could have done that work less than me. But what was interesting now is, now in today's society, there's a lot of foreign workers that come in, they do all the work that we used to do. And so the kids aren't mowing the lawns. The kids aren't doing all those things. They're not washing. We had a window washing business. We washed windows all over town and made a ton of dough. Now you got 5 guys come in, they do it in 10 seconds, and they charge a cheap amount of money. And in some cases, our kids don't want to work for that kind of dough. Well, that's what you did because you weren't getting it from me. And he knew how much money was in his wallet, which was pretty, like you took $5, he might have $150, and he knew it. So you didn't mess around with trying to get it the easy way. You weren't light-fingered Louie. That would get you in a world of hurt. So you knew that the consequences were going to be very severe. And he said, that's the only way I knew how to raise you boys, because if I didn't do it, you guys would have just completely run off. And, there were families where they didn't have those kind of guardrails, and in some cases, the kids just spun out, and really, that was a time where if you wanted to, you could completely go off the reservation, and bad things happened. Kids died, drove drunk, things, bad things. And my mom used to be great because she would make up stories. She literally would just lie to us. Like, she didn't want us to go play at the school on the weekends when there was nobody there. Long school, great to skateboard down a hallway, but 1,000 ways to crack your head open with no witnesses. So she told us that there was a naked man that was living there on the weekends and that he would run around. There's no way I wanted to be chased by a naked man, so I totally stayed clear of that. But in ancient England, they used to make up stories about water fairies and things, and most of it was to scare little kids out of going into the woods. It was just all part of the mythology, our mythology. Yeah. And what I like so much about just kind of leaving these footprints is that's our mythology, and it's changing. So, why not record it? Maybe unique to me or whomever, my generation, but, I think preserving our mythology is very important for us as a society. And Robert Redford, I think, once said a quote that the biggest problem we have as a society is we're losing touch with our own mythology as a people.
You have, 3 or 4 kids of your own?
I do. One of them is back there, hiding.
You raise them the same way?
I would say that my guardrails are a little softer, but I think that gratefully I have a partner who is right behind who is infinitely tougher than I am. So it all balances out. I am the non-executive chairman. As I should be. I'm too much of a soft touch.
2 questions for you, Michael.
Yeah.
One, as your father aged, did any of those characteristics mellow at all? Was there more compassion as he aged? And then the second one, what comes out of your mouth these days that you kind of have that oh crap moment? That was my dad talking.
Oh, there are plenty of those. I think as the kids get older, I find the need to filter what I say less. Where when they were younger, I was terribly concerned about making sure that no profanity escaped my lips, no thing that I would have really thought about what I said. So I apologize a lot. That's probably the difference. My father's never apologized for anything. The best you could do is say, "Hey, you okay?" I would say, he'd run over you in the car and they'd stop and say, "Hey, can I give you a lift to the hospital?" But we had a very funny incident with my dad one night where when we were living in London, and I was lamenting the fact that we had to do a major layoff at our company, and I was feeling really bad about some of the people that we laid off, and it made me kind of second guess whether I was cut out to be a CEO, because it just burned me up, and I was really upset about it. I kind of felt like I'd failed him. And my dad, he sat there and listened to me. He said, you got to make some of those tough decisions. You got some people that work hard and some people that don't. The people that aren't working hard are picking your pocket. You're going to have to thin the ranks, and that's basically how you run a company. And my mother kind of smiled, and she was proud of me for feeling bad, but she looked at him and said, "You're not really sorry about anything you've ever done, are you?" He goes, "No." So I'd ask my son whether he's mellowed or not. I don't know. You think Grandpa's mellowed? Cole knows how to get him wound up by just talking politics. So all he does is you have to mention a few names and then he'll go off. So, but I think some of it is almost part of his caricature now. I think he says it purposely because he knows it gets this kind of almost incredulous laugh out of us, like, you can't say that. But he's also at an age where, that generation used fear very effectively as a way of driving them in business and driving them in a lot of things. But there's still a fearful generation that gets really wound up with emails and Fox Channel and everything, where it's like, my dad's convinced that, Obamacare is going to move a whole family of immigrants into the first floor of his house, and that he's going to have to, go wait in a clinic somewhere in Detroit. I mean, that's literally just, and he's a retired CEO himself. He's a smart guy, but, at a certain point, you can allow yourself to get really wound up. And so there is that part of him that will never, ever cease being conservative, and will never cease believing that there's a core set of values that we should never compromise as a society. Once we do that, we become the Roman Empire, and they slow decline, and the Vandals and Huns are just around the corner,
But interesting, though, that from what I know of you, you're still a Republican.
Well, I am a registered independent. And so, and my friends over there would tell you he's a diehard liberal because my friends are conservative, and I tend to be I almost feel I have the need to defend the other side out of just a need, because after living in Europe for so many years, I kind of feel like there's so much gray, and I feel we're so polarized right now that, I mean, the column I wrote that'll appear in the paper is really about a conversation my son and I had where he was saying, I'm trying to figure out my political orientation, and so I said, well, tell me what you think about it. He's like, well, I think about this. These are something I believe in. Well, that sounds like you're a Democrat. And then he said something about fiscal conservatives, and I said, well, that sounds like you're a Republican. And by the end of it, he's like got both sides where he's socially compassionate but fiscally conservative, and desperate to find a center place that doesn't seem to be populated. As I said, there's no clubhouse for those guys. So I would say I'd probably, err on the side of being, probably more willing than some to kind of, try to support, certain things that I think aren't right in society, maybe almost to a fault, kind of altruistically, as opposed to just trust that, tiny government, and limited regulation and 1,000 points of light will lift us all to greatness. I'm just not, maybe I'm a bit too jaundiced for that. But I lived in Europe long enough to know that entitlements don't work. So somewhere in the middle, and that makes it very confusing. When people say, well, what the hell are you? And I say, I don't know. According to George, I'm a unicorn. So, very rare. So a nice friendly unicorn, but, it's rare,
How old is your father?
My dad's 82. And he's still, I get emails from him in capitals all the time. If this is true, we're all screwed. And they're forwarded by all his friends who are retired who are all saying the same thing. So it's very, very funny. But, when I wrote this book, I didn't want to lampoon or disrespect him because I love him. But I also don't always agree with him. But, you get to be a kid, you kind of grow up and you worship, your parents are the center of the universe, and you believe everything they say, and you kind of adopt their theology and their politics, and then somewhere along the way you develop your own. And then you still love them, but you see them for what they are, that they're just a product of their own experiences and what they had, and some things you agree with and some things you don't, but you never stop loving them. You just have a different point of view. As opposed to, you're wrong, God is Republican. But, that speech did happen, by the way. But, I also, John lived it with his family, a lot of my friends have lived it, but I think it's important because it's part of the fabric of who we are, and it's embedded in our DNA. The key is whether those seeds will germinate, and just like our kids, you always wonder which seeds are going to germinate and when, and that's just part of parenting. John.
By the way, Red Asphalt was the movie I saw.
Well, you and I were in the same, you're just 1 year ahead of me.
I'm just curious how you came about the name Patton. Was it because Patton lived in our town?
Yeah, because George S. Patton, the general, lived in our town. And there's a church called Rose's Church where that was his church, and there's a statue of him there. And Carl was named after someone John and I know, a guy by the name of Carl Hutter, who was a friend of my brother's. And but I just thought the name Patton was so appropriate. And if you read the other book, the mother named the boys after apostles. That was her kind of Irish contribution, and the father got the, got the surname in there. But my mother's side of the family were wild Irish people from Northern California, and kind of some Germans thrown in there, and there were people hanging from trees and falling out and doing crazy things, and then his side was much more straight down the middle of the fairway, Midwestern, all the way. So. I don't know, it's like you would think that everything I did in college would have erased my memory entirely, but I actually have incredible powers of recall about things that are frightening. That I am kind of the family historian. I think part of it is that I etch everything with a I'm a very emotional person, so everything's in a folder that's kind of attached around an emotion, and so I remember it all. I remember names, I remember places back to probably maybe 3-4 years old. My parents are dying to have me write a third one, which is all set in the early 60s, and I'm thinking about it, but I got to really go back in the well. I was 2, but you know what? But it's fiction, and it's not about me. So, it will be more challenging, there's no doubt, but my mom literally, she's got Parkinson's disease. She kind of goes in and out. My dad's had a couple strokes, and they're determined to memorialize that time, because that time for them is probably the best time, when we were all really young, and they were struggling as a couple. They didn't have any money, and they just kind of made it all work. And they look back on, they're very proud of what they've done. And they're very proud of us, but that is a precious time for them that they would love to see memorialized in print. And there is some really funny stories, because we were like the haunted house on our street with 4 little boys. And, my mom quit drinking literally cold turkey. She was kind of wild in college, but literally as soon as she had the kids, she said, I woke up one day, I was 25 years old. I had 4 boys under 6 years old. I'm living on a military base in Fort Lewis, Washington. I knew I had to kind of grow up. And then she just began a process. But, so it's, but they have some great stories, and they seem to be able to. It's funny, when my mom sometimes yields to Parkinson's and she's not reachable, but I get her talking about the past, and man, she goes back and she can remember what shirt you're wearing on Tuesday, like the 3rd of July in '64, which is great, because that's the way we connect, And I'm probably the one that spends the most time with them talking about those things. They love doing the nostalgia thing with me, so I just kind of carefully record, and so.
It's amazing how people with Alzheimer's can go back and remember everything of their youth.
Yep.
It's really quite remarkable. I know that it's the same thing.
Well, the brain is such an interesting thing, and I think we have so much attachment to our past, and so much defines who we are. But well, anyway, thank you for coming and listening, so I appreciate it.